And we are now recording. Again, thank you for joining us for Illinois Archaeology with our speaker, Michelle Berg. Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. All right. So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. As Dwayne said, I am Michelle Berg. I'd like to put a picture of myself up there so you know who is talking to you. I am an Ag and Natural Resources Program Coordinator with the University of Illinois Extension. I work with the Calhoun, Cass, Greene, Morgan, and Scott County Unit. And I also work through a partnership with the McCully Heritage Project in Campsville, Illinois, which is in Calhoun County, Illinois. So there is my email, and I will give that email to you at the end of the presentation as well if you have any questions. I am an archaeologist, and I have worked mostly as a contract archaeologist in Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas before I started working in my current position with the University of Illinois Extension and the McCully Heritage Project. So as a land grant institution, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists in order to remind ourselves and our community. We'll begin this program with the following statement. The University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign sits on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Pinashkawa, Wea, Miami, Muscatan, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community inclusive of all of our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. So that said, the focus today is natural resource sciences in archaeology, but I want to start by saying archaeology is anthropology, and it's really about the people. So the natural resource sciences are used to understand the lives and tell the stories of the past people of Illinois. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about archaeology. This slide, I also wanted to point out, the picture on the left is obviously Illinois. All of those little red spots you see on that map are recorded sites within Illinois. So these sites in the state database of recorded sites. So you can kind of see some patterns. These sites could be prehistoric sites, they could be 1,000-year-old sites, they could be 13,000-year-old sites, or they could be historic sites. So they could be 100-year-old sites or 75-year-old sites. So you can kind of see some patterns in this data. You can see a lot of sites located along river valleys or stream or tributaries to rivers. But you might also note sort of some of these strange straight lines of sites that go across the state. And those are not historical trails, but they are actually modern trails. So those sites like here or here are probably highway projects. So as I mentioned, I was a contract archaeologist, and a lot of contract archaeology is highway projects. So any federal money that goes into building a highway, an archaeological survey is done. So a lot of sites are recorded along major highways. Not all of those sites are excavated. They might just be recorded because they may not be significant enough to excavate. But as you can see, there are a lot of sites in Illinois. And if you were to extrapolate this data to areas that have not been surveyed, the entire state of Illinois would probably be covered in archaeological sites. I want to start today with some resources for you The first is the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, which is part of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. There are dozens of archaeologists with ISAS doing research across the state, and they have field stations around the state. And they really are the best place to go for archaeological questions and inquiries. The first place for you to start with this is go to their website, which I have here, and click on this Ask an Archaeologist button on their page. That will take you to a way that you can ask an archaeologist questions or submit pictures of artifacts if you have questions, or it also kind of has a frequently asked question information about if you find a site, what do you do, and how do you document sites and things like that. So a really great resource for everybody. Another great resource is the Illinois State Museum. The Illinois State Museum has both natural history and Illinois archaeology and history exhibits. And the Illinois State Museum Research and Collections Facility houses thousands, millions really, of scientific specimens, as well as records and artifacts from sites excavated throughout the state. So they are also an excellent resource for both researchers and non-researchers. And I wanted to point out this nice little publication that was put out by the Illinois State Museum, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, and the Illinois Archaeological Survey. This publication, which you can get as a PDF at the link I've got there. Actually, it's not a link, but the site, the address I have there. And this is a guide to visiting archaeological and historical sites and exhibits around the state. So some of this, and this is, they have the state broken down into different sections. So if you live in the northern part of the state, you can find some nearby exhibits or archaeological sites or historical sites. So before we begin, a lot of folks who may be joining us do collect artifacts. And so it is important to remind you to be a responsible collector. There are laws and ethical concerns regarding human remains. So always be aware that there are both state and federal laws regarding human remains and the burial goods that might be associated with those human remains. And that includes burial mounds as well. There are also some ethical concerns in disturbing human remains. So like I said, the archaeological deposits are about the people, and those human remains are the ancestors of people. They are real people. And so we need to maintain that in our heads when we're thinking about this, not just as archaeology, but what they really represent. That said, context is really important for understanding the archaeological record. And what I hope you will take away from this presentation, I hope it will help you understand why the context of the artifacts found is important. So assemblages of materials found together at a site or local area have more scientific value than do collections of pristine isolated examples. So a lot of people like to go out and collect arrowheads, and that's fine. But if that arrowhead or spear point that you find may be associated with other archaeological material, and that archaeological material grouped together really has a lot more scientific value and can tell the story of the people who left them behind so much better than just that one single artifact. So be a responsible collector, record your finds, and share your information with professional researchers. A good way to do that is to check out the Illinois State Archaeological Survey page. So when most people think of archaeology, this is really, I think, what they think of, the arrowheads and the spear points. So here we have a nice representation of the types of arrowheads and spear points that you might find in Illinois through time, from 13,000 BC all the way up to historic times. But while the stone tools are important to telling the stories of the people of the past, there's so much more to archaeological sites. And this is kind of where a lot of the natural resource sciences come in. So archaeological research informs and is informed by many other fields. Those fields include botany, zoology, ecology, geomorphology, geology, geography, soil sciences, history, malacology, palynology, ethnography, dendrology, chemistry, genetics, and climatology. And when I work with students talking about archaeology, I will often tell them they can pretty much be any kind of scientist they want to be and still work in archaeology. So first science we're going to cover is chemistry. Many of you may have heard of radiocarbon dating. This is one of the best and precise ways to date archaeological deposits. So radiocarbon dating is a method that provides objective age estimates for carbon-based materials that originated from living organisms. The age can be estimated by measuring the amount of carbon-14 present in a sample and comparing this against an internationally used reference standard. So these carbon-based materials are usually things like charred seeds or charred nutshells or just charred or carbonized wood, but also bones can be radiocarbon dated. Just a little note about dating. You often, if you're reading literature about archaeology and archaeological sites, you may see dates written in different ways. And so I thought I would just go ahead and quickly explain that. So AD is fairly well known, and AD is essentially, it stands for, it's Latin for in the year of our Lord, or it's the common era. So it's essentially, we are in 2022 AD. We're in the common era now. It starts at 0 and moves forward. BC stands for before Christ, and it starts at 0 and works backwards. BCE, which you may also often see, is before the common era, and that's essentially the same as BC. It starts at 0 and goes backwards. And then there's, sometimes you will see before present, and then you have to do some math. So before present, you take 2022 and you go back, or 2022, and then you would go backwards. So just for example, 13,000 BC would be about 15,000 BP.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes.
I think the slide just previous to this, there were some terms on there that I'll have to admit, even myself, didn't really know what they were. Could you go back and
I am going to, some of those, I'm going to explain.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And if I don't hit them, I will ask me and I will explain them at the end.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yep. Okay, this might be one of them. So our next natural resources science is biology, sort of overarching is biology. But we have, under biology, we have zooarchaeology, and zooarchaeology is the study of animal bones. So bones, even bone fragments, can be identified to species. Was it a deer? Was it a turtle? Was it a turkey or a fish? What kind of fish was it? How big was it? And how many were there, at the site? So archaeologists collect these bones from archaeological sites and they analyze them to understand how the people on that site lived. The bones can tell us what kind of meat people were eating, but they can also tell us what the environment was like at the time that site was occupied. They can tell us what resources people were using. Were they aquatic resources or were they woodland resources? And they may even be able to tell us some things about seasonality of a site. So malacology, and this may be one that most people are not familiar with, malacology is the study of mollusks and snails. And this can be important in archaeology for a couple of reasons. Sometimes clamshells, if they're using aquatic resources, you may find clamshells that on sites and that were used for food. And also those shells may have been used for other tools and other things as well. And those clamshells can actually be identified to species based on, based on the characteristics of the shell. But also snails are very particular about their environment. So if archaeological deposits are found and specific tiny little snails are recovered from that particular site in those archaeological deposits, they can tell us something about the environmental conditions at the time that the site was occupied. So it's kind of a neat science that relates to archaeology. Botany is a very important science in the archaeological world. Archaeobotany is the study of archaeological botanical remains. And archaeologists use a technique called flotation to extract botanical material. So they're recovering tiny charred or carbonized seeds and nutshells and wood from archaeological deposits. And this process called flotation is essentially what it sounds like. You take a sample of soil from an archaeological site, you put it in a bin that has a screen or a tub that has a screen on the bottom of it, and you put that in a barrel of water. The botanical remains will most generally float to the top of that water, and then they'll be skimmed off of that sample. And this is a way to recover those tiny little seeds that are very difficult to recover. And then the heavier materials sink to the bottom and are recovered in the bottom of that screen. And those include things like those tiny snail shells, tiny bone fragments, and other very small artifacts. And then here's a picture of an archaeologist sorting those seed-filled samples under a microscope. And what those seeds tell us is they give us environmental information, obviously, and they also tell us what the plants and what plants the people were utilizing at that particular site. Another botanical science that is used by archaeology is pollen studies, and that's palynology. So pollen can be collected from soil samples at a site, and it can tell us what the environment was like at the time that the site was occupied. So using the archaeological information tied in with the pollen, we can begin to assign dates to climatic and environmental change. So soils are hugely important in archaeology. So usually in extension and in agriculture, we talk about soil fertility, and we really are usually focused on the topsoil. But to most archaeologists, the topsoil is really the least interesting soil. Soils can tell us about landform formation. They can tell us, was a site buried by flooding, perhaps? And archaeology has been used to tell how often flooding has occurred, and it has been used to date major flooding events in the Mississippi River Valley and elsewhere. Studies by geoarchaeologists have looked at soils to relate these major flooding events to archaeological site and then to date those major flooding events. So a good geoarchaeologist can look at soils and can understand those landform formations, like how did that soil get there? And then also, is there a culture? So the example on the right there is a very deeply buried cultural deposit. So that's people. And then that was buried by alluvium, which is fairly important. So you do have to understand soils. And very interestingly, soils in archaeology have even been used to date earthquakes. So for example, most of us know about the New Madrid earthquake that occurred in 1811, but geologists have been studying the New Madrid earthquake zone and using archaeology to understand timing of different earthquakes before that 1811 one. So essentially they're relating those earthquake events through their signatures in the soils in the New Madrid area. And if they can find an archaeological site, they're able to date some of those earthquake occurrences in that area. So let's jump into the early peoples of Illinois. And then I'll kind of relate as we go how some of the natural resources sciences tie into what we know about these people. So the Paleo-Indian period is about 13,000 BC to 9,000 BC. These were America's first people. The time and that date, that early date, there are a lot of early sites being found, and it could get pushed back. That's a good date we have for Illinois, but people were all throughout North America at that time, and we're always looking for the earliest people. So these were America's first people. This time period was at the end of the last ice age, and much of the world's water was tied up in glaciers and ice caps. And the land that some land that is underwater now was exposed. And so we know that at least some of the first people in America came across the Bering Land Bridge, which is the bridge of land between modern day Russia and Alaska. And we know that obviously these people were traveling very far. They were nomadic people. They hunted with spears and atlatls, which are a very specialized spear thrower. And also during this time, there was the megafauna. And we have evidence that people hunted megafauna. And we know that mammoths and mastodons were present in Illinois. We have that from sort of the zoo archaeology. But there are Clovis sites, which is the earliest culture in Illinois. There are Clovis sites in Illinois where points are found in direct association with mastodon bones. And there are some theories that humans had something to do with the extinction of the megafauna. And I think those theories are kind of largely shifting more toward there was adaptation to climate change, and the megafauna kind of, humans maybe didn't have a humongous impact on it, but may have had something to do with it. Let's see, the archaeology of this time period, really the earliest part of this time period, is characterized by a distinctive style of stone tool called a Clovis point. And one of the ways natural resources plays into our understanding of Clovis is through chert sourcing. So chert is the stone used for making most stone tools. This is geology, right? It's stones. And certain types of chert come from certain areas of the country. So we know through sourcing the chert from Clovis points, particularly here's an example, sourcing the chert from Clovis points found in St. Clair County, Illinois, which is way western Illinois, that Clovis people were using chert to make their tools that was found 600 miles away in Indiana. So they knew that chert was in Indiana, they collected it, and it was, you know, they made their tools from it, but they lived in, or at least at some point lived in St. Clair County, Illinois. Well, what we know now is St. Clair County. And then by the end of the Paleo-Indian period, there was climate shift underway, and we begin to see a change in the stone tool type to what we call the Dalton tools or the Dalton culture. And these people appear to be more settled. And part of that is through this chert sourcing. Sorry about that. Through this chert sourcing, which again, is geology, we find that the Dalton type of points are made using more local sources of chert. So they're getting their raw materials locally rather than traveling very large distances. If we move on to the Archaic period, which is about 9,500 to 800 BC. At this time, about 9,000 to 7,000 BC, we begin to see a major climatic shift. We can see this in the faunal, the animal record, but also in the plants. So in this plant information, the understanding of the changing vegetation and the changing environment at this time comes largely through those pollen records. So that palynology really helps us understand this major climatic shift. And so we see a shift by about 9,000 BC, the spruce, which are sort of a northern cold climate species, have largely disappeared from Illinois. And then we find a mixed coniferous forest that includes fir and pine, and then elm, ash, and oak in our deciduous forests. And then eventually we have this shift to the tall grass prairie. And Illinois becomes what we know as the prairie state. And the prairie state may have happened by accident, but it didn't happen necessarily naturally, right? So there is evidence, and people are studying this now, that we're beginning to understand that the expansion of the prairie throughout the state of Illinois may have happened through some systematic burning that was done by humans. And so they may have been starting fires for hunting purposes or just for land clearing purposes. But this led to the expansion of the prairie. And there's research ongoing about this now, and hopefully we will hear about it maybe through one of these webinars someday. And about 2000 BC, the climate and the topography were essentially about what they are today. So also during the Archaic periods, we know that people lived in small groups. They were hunter-gatherers. And we see evidence of heavy use of the river environment. So the rivers were really important to these people. One of the things we find are stone woodworking adzes, which were important in making dugout canoes. I don't believe we have found any dugout canoes in Illinois, but they have been found in the Midwest and during this period, or from this period. And we see archaeological deposits full of aquatic resources like fish and waterfowl. And then the other thing we see during the Archaic period is we see our groundstone technology. So your points and your arrowheads are chipped stone. Your groundstone technology are things like manos and grinding stones like manos and metates, and also grooved axes. So we see those toward the middle Archaic period. And those metates were used for grinding nuts and processing seeds and perhaps starchy roots. And then we see some new cooking technologies coming in, and the steaming. We have steaming over hot rocks in the Middle Archaic, and then we have boiling in skin and clay lined pits in the late Archaic. plant use in the Archaic period. So as I mentioned, we are able to recover a lot of plant remains. So plant use in the Archaic, what we understand about it is we think there was an active management of mast producing trees and shrubs, especially hickory. So the management of, say, those hickory trees, we find on Archaic sites a lot of hickory, a lot of charred hickory nuts. And so we think that people were clearing the underbrush and opening the canopy through burning and through cutting and girdling. So that's where those groundstone axes would come in. And what this did was it simplified production and collection of these nuts. And it increased suitable habitat for animals such as deer, squirrels, rabbits, and turkeys. And then in the late Archaic, there's evidence of cultivation of plants, which is really exciting. So we see in the botanical record that the late Archaic people were selecting for certain what we would consider weedy plants, and they were cultivating. So they weren't actually farming them, but they were gardening them and promoting their growth within their nearby to their communities. And so some of those plants include sumpweed, which is also called marsh elders, and sunflower and goosefoot. A lot of you may see goosefoot quite often in your gardens, and as well as squash. I am getting a note that my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully I'll keep you guys on here. So one of the really interesting things during the Archaic period is and in Illinois is some of the oldest domesticated dog burials have been found in Illinois. And these were found in Greene County and Pike counties. And these are from the Archaic period. So here's an example of the Coster dog, which was found at the Coster site in Greene County, Illinois, which is just across the river from me today. This dog burial is about 10,000 years old. We know that this was a domesticated dog because the way that it was buried is it's buried in the community site. It's actually buried on the habitation site, but it was also buried. You can see the rock above the skull of this dog. And so it was buried with artifacts. So we know that it was intentionally buried, and it was most likely a member of this community. Now, whether it was very unlikely it was a pet as we think of pets today, but it was an important part of that community. Dogs have often been used as, for hunting or for protection, but we also do form bonds with them, even working dogs. So moving into the woodland periods. We know that the early woodland period, based on archaeological evidence, we know that the people were living very much the same as during the late Archaic period. So the archaeological evidence during this time period indicates they were eating a lot of nuts, they were using the river environments. And I mentioned just briefly sort of those changes in the ways of cooking through the Archaic period. Well, the huge technological change in the early woodland was we have the appearance of pottery. So we have the appearance of these clay pots, and this is kind of a game changer, and it is a new way of cooking. So as far as much like with the sort of the chert sourcing, archaeologists can look at clay from pottery fragments and figure out where that clay came from. It's obviously not the same as chert sourcing, but it's some chemistry and things like that. And so they can figure out where people were collecting the clay from which the pots at certain sites were made from. So, and there are clay deposits all up and down the Illinois River. And then during the Middle Archaic period, we have a really big changes in the society of people who live here. So we have this fluorescence of social, political, and ritual complexity. We have a couple kind of a separation. We can identify in the artifacts kind of this Havana and Hopewell, which are the Havana are kind of like common wares of pottery, and then the Hopewell are more fancy wares. So here's an example of a Hopewell pot, and you can see that the decorations on that pot is a spoon-billed bird. So you can see some of that natural history coming through in the iconography of the artifacts. The other thing that we begin to see with some of the pottery is we start to see some different kinds of decorations that they may have used plants to just decorate the pots or to create a surface on those pots, or they may have used cordage, and that cordage was made from plants. And so, that all ties into what kind of plants were they using to make the cords? What kind of plants were they, what kind of reeds were they using to just make these decorations on these pots? And the other thing that happens in the Middle Woodland period is we begin to see a lot of materials that come from very far away from Illinois. So we see stone tools from stone that can only be found in Montana or in the Rocky Mountains. We see shell artifacts that are shells that can only be found in the Gulf or Atlantic coasts. And we see copper from the northern Great Lake areas. And so, through our natural resources, we can source all of those things, and we can see how these trade networks may have existed. And then finally, in our woodland periods, we have the late woodland period. And so there's a couple of really exciting things we see in the archaeological record during the late woodland period. So major technological shift is that we start to see the use of the bow and arrow. So we begin to find these little tiny stone points, which are arrowheads. So a lot of people think of any stone tool they find as an arrowhead, but most arrowheads are very tiny little things. So the bigger ones are usually spear points or knives or something like that. So this is a huge technological change. Of course, there's some natural resources involved with this. This is just kind of a nice little trivia tidbit. So Osage orange, which is also sometimes known as the bow dark tree, that's French for bowwood, is considered by some to be the best wood for making a bow. And some of you may know Osage orange as the hedge tree, and it is the tree. A lot of people don't like them, but it is the tree that produces those big green hedge balls, essentially. And that's what we call them, our hedge balls. So, and there are, I know that there was a theory out there at one time from an archaeologist in Southwest Arkansas, trying to figure out if the bow and arrow might have originated in Southwest Arkansas, and kind of saw an expansion of the Osage orange tree sort of from that area. So I don't know, how far that theory ever went, but it was just kind of an interesting one. And then the other thing that happens in the late woodland period that we can see through archaeological or through archaeobotanical evidence is we have the first appearance of maize, and I probably shouldn't have put agriculture on there. We have the first appearance of maize. And so essentially we see corn in the late woodland. It's the earliest point we see corn in the state, and it's really in its earliest form. So it's tiny little seed heads of corn. And it appears in at sites in Illinois around 800 or 900 AD. But it is not a major food crop at that time, like we think about now. But this is one of the really exciting things that happened during the woodland periods. It's the beginning of agriculture in North America, right? So archaeobotanists have identified a number of plants that they consider to be part of the Eastern agricultural complex. And if you're reading archaeological literature, you might see this referred to as EAC plants. And the changes in these plants from wild to domesticated can be traced through time through archaeological collections. So the scientists take those little bitty seeds and they analyze them, they measure how big they are, and they measure the thickness of their seed heads, and can tell that these plants have begun to become domesticated. So most of these plants are considered weeds today, and they include little barley, marsh elder or sumpweed, goosefoot, or chenopodium. I also just wanted to note that, like, the seeds from goosefoot can be eaten and are very nutritious, and we know that they probably were eaten. And they have obviously been collected. Here's a picture of some. But the leaves of the plant are also very nutritious and were very likely eaten as well. But the archaeological evidence of consumption of leafy greens really doesn't exist, as far as I know. So, if you can just imagine why that is, they're, essentially just green leaves. So having those preserved is pretty difficult. But the beginning of agriculture is very, very, very exciting. And that's something that has happened in Illinois. So moving on to the Mississippian period. Mississippian period is characterized by the appearance of urban centers. We have monumental scale architecture and ritual behavior. Our monumental scale architecture comes in the form of mounds. Now, the middle woodland people and the late woodland people also built mounds. Mounds are built with soil. And so that's another place that soil science can really come into play. So archaeologists really do have to understand soil. And then the other thing is we have sort of an ethnic diversity, and we have accompanying political and religious symbols. We have an increase in population. And then during this time, maize agriculture, and this is truly agriculture, takes hold, and we can see this in the botanical evidence and the change in that plant specifically. So we can, we have collected through time samples of corn, and we can see that it's become a farmed, essentially, plant. But that said, that starchy seed agriculture, those plants I mentioned before in the Eastern agricultural complex were likely also farmed at the same time as the corn was. So here is an artist's depiction of probably the most famous Mississippian site. So as I mentioned, this time period is kind of characterized by urban centers. Cahokia or Cahokia Mounds was the largest urban center it's located in Illinois, but it really was the largest urban center in North America. So archaeologists think that at its peak, there were over 20,000 people living at Cahokia. And that doesn't include all the hamlets and villages that surrounded the city and supported it. So if you can just imagine the environmental impact of a city like this and all the farming that would go into supporting a city like this, then you can kind of imagine sort of all of the just changes in the environment, at least in that area. I wanted to mention Cahokia is a state site. It is also a World Heritage Site, and it's a pretty neat site. So if you haven't had a chance, please go visit it. If you can make it down there. It's just outside of East St. Louis. My final couple slides, I want to talk about historical archaeology and environmental studies. So archaeologists don't just study prehistoric people, but also post-contact people. We do archival studies and oral histories, and we can look at environmental change through time this way as well. So here's an example from a project that I was involved in some time ago called Picturing Change. For this project, we collected historical photos that included some aspect of the environment in them in an effort to track environmental change over the last 100 years or so. Through these pictures. So this is in this example on the left, this is a picture from Hamburg, Illinois, which is on the Mississippi River, a little village on the Mississippi River. And you can see that hill slope behind in the background is pretty well void of trees. There are a few maybe cedar trees encroaching on there. There probably is a hill prairie up there on the edge. And then we returned to this spot in 2009 and we took a photo, and you can see that there's been a huge environmental change on that hillside in the last 100 years. There is possibly still hill prairie remnant up there, but there also are, that's a monument up on top of that hill. So that little empty spot you see up there has actually been maintained to stay clear of trees. And another example from the Picturing Change project, in the upper right here, you see pictures of Camp Mansion. The camps were the namesake of Campsville, Illinois. And in 1997, we excavated a privy or an outhouse behind the Camp Mansion that we determined to date to around 1920. The privies were often used for disposing of trash, so they can tell us a lot about the people who used them. And in this privy, we found hundreds and hundreds of squirrel skulls, some of which are pictured here on the right. And then through the Picturing Change project, we came upon this photograph of M.A. Camp's stepson on a squirrel hunt with his friends. So the historical photo just brings to life the archaeological evidence that was left behind in that privy. And so this is kind of a really nice example of just how some of the natural resources can tie in with some of that, even archival studies. So that's what I have for you today. I want to encourage you again, as Wayne mentioned, we do an everyday environment webinar series, the second Thursday of the month, and I think that's what it is. And the next one will be on geothermal energy, so you probably will be getting a registration link to that. So register for that if you are interested. And I wanted to end again with my contact information, and feel free to email me. And then below here is a link and a QR code. If you would kindly take our survey to tell us how we did today, that would be fantastic. That's very valuable information for us. And then I also just wanted to give you the link again to the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, because they are the home of many, many archaeologists in the state of Illinois.
All right, thank you very much, Michelle. We do have a few questions, so we will go ahead and start getting into those. First one, what time period was the mastodon found in Illinois?
So that would be, those are early. right? So that's Paleo-Indian. So that's, 13,000, probably around 13,000 to 10,000 BC.
Okay. Another question. Are there any pre-Clovis human evidence, or is there any pre-Clovis human evidence in Illinois?
No. So Clovis is the earliest evidence of the people of Illinois that we have. So those are the oldest points, and that is for the most part what we have left of those people. So if you think about things that can last for over 10,000 years well, I shouldn't say that because we do have some bones, but depending on the environment, right? Stone is probably the most likely is gonna last, right, for that long. And so the Clovis is really the earliest evidence we have in Illinois.
Okay, next question. Could you give a quick explanation of what girdling is?
Girdling? Oh, sure. So girdling is essentially removing the bark around the outside of the lower layer of a tree. So if you were to remove the bark from the bottom of a tree, it essentially deprives that, because the bark is the living layer of the tree. The bark protects what allows the top of the tree to live. So it protects the living tissue. So if you remove that, it essentially then kills the tree without having to fell the tree, to chop it down.
The next question is there any evidence of Hopewell large-scale geometric mounds in Illinois?
Yeah, there are. They're not as big as the Mississippian mounds, but there are large Hopewell mounds, mound groups in Illinois. Yes. And I think that little places of the past. I'm trying to think if there's any open sites where you can actually go and see those mounds. There probably are, but I don't have any of them off the top of my head. But that little places of the past booklet will describe some of those to you.
Are there local volunteer opportunities in archaeology?
Often there are local volunteer opportunities. And you would have to just kind of, it's a little bit more specialized. So if you have a local office of the state archaeological survey, they might let you come in and help wash artifacts and things. You were to go to one of the state historical sites, they may have some docent work that they'd be willing to let you do. As far as digging, usually they want you to have some experience, obviously. Illinois doesn't have a program like this, but the state survey at Arkansas has a really great, they do a field school every summer for essentially amateur archaeologists, people who are not archaeologists, but who want to know how to be archaeologists. And that program is formed to kind of create a core of volunteer archaeologists. So if an emergency project comes up, they can kind of call on their core of volunteers. If possible, hopefully we can come up with some volunteer opportunities through the Master Naturalist program, but I don't know of any at the moment.
Stay tuned on that.
Right.
Another question, what trade networks existed in the late Woodland?
The late Woodland, really, it's kind of an interesting period because it became a lot, I don't want to say simpler, but if you want to think about it as a slightly simpler way of life, it became more local, let's say. And so people were still hunting and gathering, and they were they had their hamlets, and they were farming. They're small little farming communities, but they were not an extensive trade network like during the Middle Woodland. And then when you get into the Mississippian, you have you have more extensive trading as well.
Next question. What part of the country did the earliest inhabitants come from?
Well, so we know that people came across the Bering Land Bridge, and we think we know that they brought their dogs with them from North Asia, and so the DNA evidence. There have been some studies on the DNA from those early domesticated dogs. And the DNA from those dogs showed that their lineage was from North Asia. So if you want to follow that trail, we can say in North America, people came from Alaska. There are other theories that people came across the Atlantic and into the eastern part of the US. And those are good, and I think becoming more accepted theories. But the Bering Land Bridge has always been a main one, and we do know that the dogs did come from there, so we can figure that people came from there too.
Okay, we got time for maybe one or two more questions. The next one is, can you explain the ethnic diversity in the Mississippian period?
So there was a lot of, and that comes from the Cahokia site was a gathering site. And so, yeah, it was a city, but there were a lot of people sort of coming in and out of that city. So they were maybe just coming in there seasonally. And so you have just a lot of different people meeting other different people, right? So there were people coming up the Mississippi River from Arkansas, and those people might have come, and obviously we didn't have our states, but just so you guys can get an idea, so there's people coming from the southeastern United States up to that point in central Illinois, and then you've got people coming from the north and sort of all gathering in that central location. So, it might not be the type of global ethnic diversity that we think about today, but for the peoples of Illinois at that time, it was a very diverse time period and community.
All right, this will be our last question. For those that we didn't get answered, I would just suggest that you email Michelle directly, and I'm sure that she will give you an answer once she receives your email. But this last question, what happened to the peoples living in Illinois at the end of each era you described? Did they die out, get killed by other tribes?
That's no, they did not. There really is very little evidence of warfare and violence until you get into some of those later periods. So they probably were not killed out. It's hard to kind of make this, we like to have things in straight lines, right? So, and we like to have, these identified, like, these are the markers that identify this, and these are the markers I identify that. It probably was sort of a progression, right? So they're in large part, probably the same people. There may have been people moving in and out, and mixing of some folks, but the real, and then growing of populations and people splitting off of their family groups and forming other communities and things like that. So most likely it was something like that, like just a progression and increase in population and just changing of culture through time. And then when we hit European contact, that's when things, well, Cahokia actually had been reduced in size, maybe through environmental conditions, maybe through flooding or drought or things like that. But then when we hit European contact, that's when things start to really go haywire with the populations.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. Great information there. I think we had a great turnout for this webinar as well. I want to thank everybody for joining us that are still on. Look for our next webinar next month, and we will continue to send out information on succeeding webinars. With that, again, we thank everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask Michelle, or you can send something to me at friend@illinois.edu. And with that, we are going to sign off. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.